Welcome participants at Webinar 2, International Harmonization in DUS Examination. I would like to extend you greetings from Geneva. My name is Leontino Taveira. I work for the UPOV office. The webinar today is the second on a series of 4 webinars, which has been started yesterday and will continue over the next couple of days. The background to these webinars is that the Technical Committee in 2002 agreed that preparatory workshops should be organized to help some of the delegates to participate more actively at the Technical Working Party meetings. Last year, in 2020, the Technical Committee agreed to organize these preparatory workshops as a series of webinars. The first webinar was held yesterday, and recordings of that webinar will be made available on the web pages for the Technical Working Parties, the same as for this webinar and the other 2 webinars to be held over the course of this week. This second webinar is split in 5 parts. We're going to start with 3 presentations by the Office of the Union, and we'll continue with a panel discussion. We have some guests to share their experiences with us today, and we'll complete this webinar with a session on questions and answers. So the first part of this webinar, which includes letters A, B, C, and D in this preview, will be recorded and made available on the Technical Working Party's web page. The final part of this webinar, the session on questions and answers, will be recorded for internal purposes only and will not be made available on the Technical Working Party's website. The first part of this presentation includes an explanation on the role of the Technical Working Parties and the Technical Committee. The objective is to explain to our colleagues, in particular those that are newcomers, how UPOV, the technical work of UPOV, works. So the UPOV Council, being the maximum authority in UPOV, has its consultative committee, but it also has an administrative and legal committee looking into those matters, and the technical committee looking into specifically DUS examination and how to harmonize these exams across the UPOV membership. The technical committee is assisted by the enlarged editorial committee. The technical committee oversees the work conducted by 4 crop-specific technical working parties, as well as a technical working party on automation and computer programs, and the working group on biochemical and molecular techniques. The 4 crop-specific technical working parties are responsible for drafting test guidelines, harmonizing those test guidelines that are used by UPOV members, bringing them to the international forum, and converting these into UPOV test guidelines. Along with the Technical Working Party on automation and computer programs, these technical working parties are responsible for drafting the overall guidance for DUS examination, which we refer to as TGP documents. Along with the working group on biochemical and molecular techniques, all these technical working parties discuss the use of DNA-based information in support of DUS examination. This will be the specific content of a webinar to be held on Thursday this week. Now, I would like to pass the floor on to Mr. Ben Rivoire. Please, Ben, you have the floor.
Thank you, Leontino. Hello, everyone. My name is Ben, and I work for the UPOV office. Let me take you through the second part of this presentation for today to see what is the UPOV guidance available in relation to the US examination. More specifically, what the general introduction says, what are the different TGP documents, and some explanation about test guidelines. The reason why all this guidance was put together is to learn on the best practice and based on experience from the US experts amongst UPOV members in order to gather the best practice within the UPOV family and community, in order to take good decision on the outcome of the US examination, in order to have a clear and precise definition of the object of the protection, in order to ensure a strong protection, and at the end, in order to ensure an efficiency in the method of examination. And indeed, as mentioned, to learn from the best and to learn from the practice on the field. This brings to harmonization and hence efficiency, especially when it comes to cooperation, when there is a mutual acceptance of the US report that minimize the cost for the authority, but also for the applicants. But it's also a guarantee to have mutual recognition of the way to describe variety, as everyone amongst the US expert community speak the same language and understand the same terminology. Last but not least, it is a simple and cheap way and system for applicants, as it could minimize the time and the cost for the breeders. So this is what the basis for the development of UPOV guidance. The general introduction, TG1, provide the general principle, technical principles specifically for the US examination and the US testing. There is thereafter a series of TGP documents, like for design of trials, statistical method, that will help to implement and organize the US trial and the US examination. The last part is about test guidelines, so crop-specific guidance and document that will help the US examiners to do the examination on specific crops. The general introduction is today at the third version, and it keeps to be updated according to changes in the way of doing, and again, based on the learning from the best and the practice from the field. The US expert try to always keep this introduction and all UPOV documents up to date. The first point for the US examination is to make sure what is a relevant and reliable characteristic in the scope of the US examination. Here, the first clarification is about the commercial relevance of the characteristic to be looked at by the US examiners. Because indeed, flower color or fruit color could be relevant as a characteristic for the US examination and might have a direct commercial value and relevance, but it's important to note that there are some other characteristics that could be used in the scope of the US examination that might not have commercial relevance, and it's not required, like the leaf shape. Usually for the customer buying an apple will not be relevant. However, it might be taken as a characteristic in the scope of the US examination. And this is also what is explained in the general introduction, TG1, in section 4.2.1, on the basic requirements that a characteristic should fulfill before being used in the scope of the US testing and producing a variety description. The first point is that the characteristic should result from a given genotype or a combination of genotypes. The second requirement is that this characteristic should be sufficiently consistent and repeatable in a particular environment to be used as the US characteristic. It should exhibit sufficient variation between varieties to be able to establish distinctness. It should be capable of precise definition of recognition when we talk about this specific characteristic. It should allow uniformity and stability requirements to be fulfilled, meaning that it should produce consistent and repeatable results for this specific characteristic after repeated propagation, where appropriate, at the end of each cycle of propagation. So what about some characteristics that are quite often relevant in the scope of plant breeding program, but might not be relevant in the scope of the US examination, such as yield, straw strain, for instance? Let's look back at those different criteria to be satisfied, fulfilled, in order to be recognized as a relevant and reliable characteristic to be used in the scope of the US examination. Here you can see that for characteristic fruit color or leaf shape, whatever you look at criteria given, whether it results from a given genotype, whether it's capable of precise definition and recognition, in that case, fruit color and leaf shape fulfill all the criteria. Even if the commercial value, as mentioned earlier, is relevant in some cases, for the fruit color, for instance, and not for the other one. So that means that even if there is no commercial value, and if it's fulfilled all the listed above criteria, this characteristic could be used in the scope of the UN examination. In relation to yield, as you can see, the variable and the expression of the characteristic will be too much dependent on some other criteria and environmental condition, meaning that there is too much uncertainty, meaning that even if it's a reliable trait and criteria in the scope of plant breeding program, it will not be used for the US examination and will not be acceptable in that respect. What about disease resistance, which is a very important characteristic, more and more used in agricultural crops, vegetable crops, and ornamentals as well? Here you can see back on the list of criteria to be used that disease resistance fulfill those criteria, even if we know that it's quite difficult and expensive to set up and implement disease-resistant tests in different examination offices. So that will be up to the offices to decide whether or not to use it or to ask someone else or another authority, another partner, stakeholders to do this test, disease-resistant test on their behalf. But it's possible to use it. So let's now look at the different documentation available. When we look at the full range from the constitution of the variety collection and its maintenance through the DUS growing trial to all necessary required or supplementary procedure that could be required or necessary in the scope of the US examination. And here you can see that all the TGP documents have their place in the full schematic of the DUS examination, starting with the general introduction, TG1, and all the other TGP documents, TGP2 to TGP 15, that all have their specific element to clarify one specific part of the full DUS examination process. Let me explain that more in details. From what is provided in the general introduction, especially about the notion of variety of common knowledge, to the publication of the variety description. Here you see that all notions about variety of common knowledge are set up in the general introduction. Then TGP4 helps examination offices to constitute and maintain variety collection. TGP 8 and TGP 9 provide some more detailed information about the field growing trial itself, whether the method to be used in terms of statistical method or the way to group varieties together, how to use a photograph in the scope of the US examination, how to design the trial, and how to observe characteristics. Later on in the presentation, we'll detail the different method of observation, type of record to be done in the US examination, but this is all captured in those TGP 9 or TGP 8 documents with more details and available in different languages. The last part is on assessing distinctness in the growing trial, and here again, you have a lot of method being described in TGP 8 and how to do side-by-side comparison in TGP 9. That's also why those documents are frequently updated in order to ensure that all the most recent method and technique is being reflected in UPOV guidance. The last part is about the supplementary procedure in relation to publication, cooperation between a member of the union, and other relevant information that could be useful for the US expert. Thank you, and now I'll pass back to Leontino for the rest of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Now we're going to look a bit more into the details on harmonizing the observations and how to make decisions based on these observations. And we're going to detail a bit of what you've seen in the schematic just now presented by Ben. In particular, we are going to start with the method of observation. This is of ultimate importance for examination officers, whether you're going to go into greater or a lesser level of detail. And regardless of the method of propagation of the variety, visual observations will be mostly used for those qualitative characteristics or pseudo-qualitative characteristics. By visual here, we associate with a point of reference. So there is a visual observation based on a point of reference. Such point of reference may be a color chart or another variety being grown side by side with the candidate variety. For many quantitative characteristics, measurements may be used. In this case, we refer to M as the measurement, as opposed to V in the previous slide, which referred to visual observation. Here, measurements are taken against linear calibrated scales, such as rulers or counting the number of days from sowing, for example. Document TGP-9 also provides further explanations on the types, the methods of observation. And here we're going to look into the use of the letter G, which means a single record which is kept representing a group of plants. So the letter G is associated. You will see this indication besides each characteristic in test guidelines, such as when you have, for example, vegetatively propagated ornamental plants, which are considerably homogeneous. A single variety record may be sufficient to describe and represent a group of plants. The same would be the case for self-pollinated crops, or even when you're considering parts of a plant, parts of plants, you may assess different times, but keep one single variety record representing that group of plants. And here we even have another example with a leaf blade. A part of the plant is being observed a number of times, but one single variety record is kept. The same rationale would apply when no individual records for the plants is kept, and therefore one single record is kept for an entire plot of plants, although that information may be treated statistically afterwards. This is the opposite situation for the assessment of single individual plants or parts of plants. In this case, a statistical analysis would be required and normally would be possible, which may not have been the case in the previous example. So in this case, when the characteristic is indicated with an S, there is a single record kept for each plant, and this information is normally treated with statistical analysis. As relating to types of characteristics, you will see in UPOV test guidelines the description of what type of characteristic is being assessed. And we would like to start with qualitative characteristics. Here for Clematis, you have different leaf types. You will notice there's no intermediate state, and the states of expression are clearly defined. They can explain themselves by the individual states, and they do not have any intermediate levels of expression. There's a clear-cut separation from one state of expression to the other. These are referred to as qualitative characteristics. Whereas quantitative characteristics, they vary in a linear scale. There's a continuous range of variation, such as, for example, the characteristic plant height ranging in one single direction from short to tall. For UPOV purposes, we have pseudo-qualitative characteristics, where you have at least partial linear variation. So there is linear variation at least in part of the range of expression for this characteristic in the collection. Here we have the example of color of flower for roses. There is linear variation, for example, from light to dark, but there are also separate qualitative independent states of expression, such as indicated in this slide with a blue color or a very different yellow color. So for this type of characteristic, there is partial linear variation, but this is not only the range of expression contained within the collection for varieties in this case. This relates to how to assess distinctness and the importance of notes according to those types of expression we have previously seen. For qualitative characteristics, although you may have the numbering, the scoring of numbers slightly adapted to the type of characteristic in question, such as here diploid note 2, tetraploid note 4, but being a qualitative characteristic, the difference in state of expression already means that these varieties would be distinct. The same as for other characteristics where you have, for example, variegation absent and present, although the notes scored here are 1 and 9, one note difference absent or present, this means that the varieties would be distinct. For different types of characteristics, we have the next slide, pseudo-qualitative characteristics. The assessment of distinctness is a bit more complex, as varieties that are placed far apart in the same scale may be actually more similar than varieties that are placed in nearby nodes. So the assessment of distinctness here is not the same as if we have, for example, a quantitative characteristic where you have a linear range of expression and the distances, the differences between varieties can be more clearly explained by the distance they are placed within the range of expression for the characteristic. According to the general introduction, document TG1, assessment on a side-by-side visual comparison would be preferred in the growing trial. Nonetheless, for crops where many applications are filed every year, an assessment by notes may be required, as the most similar varieties may not be grown side by side, enabling such visual comparison. In this case, we have a 2 notes rule indicating that would be a clear difference. The rationale is that you should enable at least a 1 note separation to be in line with UPOV guidance that requires a clear difference. So a clear difference would be that for quantitative characteristics where there's at least 1 note in between separating a candidate from another most similar variety. And this means at least 1 full note difference in between varieties for enabling distinctness. When you look at different scales, different ranges of expression, when we use, for example, a scale of 9 notes, a variety that scored note 1 would be clearly different from another that would score at least note 3 and onwards. So there would be at least 1 note separation in state of expression for this characteristic. For the condensed scale, for example, if you use a reduced scale of 3 notes only, you should have at least 1 note difference. So in such case, a variety that scored note 1 would only be clearly different from another variety that scored note 3. On this note, I would like to stop our presentation and continue on to our next part of the webinar, which is a panel discussion. I would like to invite to switch on your cameras Mr. Nick Hulse from Australia, the chairperson of the technical committee, and also Ms. Beate Rucker, the chairperson of the BMT and the TWC. Welcome to the webinar. We would like to start the panel discussion. You would be most welcome to provide examples and illustrate from your experience the use of the guidance we've just now presented, in particular for international harmonization in DUS examination. In this sense, we would like to start by inviting Mr. Nick Hulse to take the floor. Please, Nick, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Leontino, and welcome everyone to this webinar. When I listened to the presentation and having seen a number of these types of presentations in person previously, sometimes they can be quite daunting about the amount of information that is contained in these UPOV documents. But I think it's not necessary to be overwhelmed. When you look at them in a little detail, you can see that they deal with very different aspects of the DUS examination process. So, for example, the TGP 9 talks about distinctness. TGP 8 is these methods of examination, and we also have TGP 14, which is very useful on a glossary of terms. So I just had a few points to make. One of the, well, what I think from my experience, one of the most important aspects of being a DUS examiner is actually participating in the technical working parties. If you attend these working parties, whether it's in person, which we can't do at the moment, of course, but by virtual means, which I'm sure will be an ongoing option, you gain a lot of insight and understanding into how the UPOV system works, and the importance of having consistent terminology. When I first started, there was, I will give an example here. We produced descriptions of plant varieties where we had no real structure as to what was provided, because we had a system where the breeders gave their details of the characteristics that they felt were important, and they used all sorts of terminology to explain those characteristics. We then soon realized that having that consistent terminology was important, because we could not compare one description to another. So by following UPOV guidelines and agreeing on the appropriate terms for, the leaf shapes, for example, whether you use wide or broad for leaf width and so on, is very important, because then once you start sharing that information with other authorities, they will also have that consistent understanding of what you're actually referring to. So that was a very important part of our understanding of how the UPOV system works, and participating in the working parties, whether it be as a leading expert in one of the guidelines up for discussion, or as an interested expert. It is very worthwhile bringing along your particular interest in a species, and then seeing how that fits in the UPOV system means you can gain a lot of understanding, which you can then take back to your examination processes. One thing I might also say is that it's not always necessary to take all aspects of all the guidelines and the UPOV guidance. Each authority adapts and adopts the guidelines to suit their particular purposes. So for us, the most important part is making sure that the table of characteristics is used in the DUS examination, and in particular those characteristics which are marked as being important internationally to ensure consistent harmonization of descriptions. So they're in the guidelines, the asterisk characteristics. The other very important aspect as well, and this goes with participating in the UPOV technical working parties, is the community of DUS examiners that you meet and communicate with, which helps give a better understanding of how to do your own DUS examination. In our office in Australia, we only have 11 or 12 staff, examiners, mostly examiners. There is no one else in Australia that we can look to seek guidance. So our colleagues in in other countries, in Germany, in Europe, in South America, Japan, and so on, are invaluable in seeking guidance on particular situations that we come across from time to time. And it's a mutual exchange. We get queries from examiners from other countries, and we seek input from examiners from other countries as well as we need it. So it's a very useful resource to be able to communicate with those examiners. The other point I would like to make is, in our system, we use a lot of third parties, we call them qualified persons, to undertake a lot of the trial work, and having test guidelines is invaluable in training those qualified persons in how to conduct the examination. So that ensures the harmonization of the work we do, and our examiners are able to supervise that and make sure that we follow the guidelines. But in the absence of guidelines, it makes it very difficult because we don't have that base to start with. We can point these qualified persons to those guidelines and say, you're working on this wheat variety or this rose variety. Here's the guidelines. Here's the TGP 9 on distinctness. This is how you would consider looking at those characteristics and so on. If terminology comes up as an issue, we point them to TGP 14 and say, these are the words that we use. So from my point of view, having that the access to all these TGP documents and test guidelines is very important to the work we do, and above all else, we're able to point to the UPOV system as international best practice. So when we are questioned internally as to why we do what we do, then we can point to peer-reviewed processes that are not something that we have just invented, but have been considered carefully through the various working party meetings, the technical committee, and ultimately the council. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. We are slowly starting to receive questions. I'd like to clarify that these questions will be answered in a moment. I would like now to invite Ms. Beate Rücker to take the floor, please. Beate, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Leontino, for the introduction, and hello to everybody. It's a pleasure for me to have the possibility to contribute to this panel discussion during our webinar today. As you have heard, I'm working in several UPOV working parties since quite a long time, but my main place of activity is the Bundessortenamt, the Federal Plant Variety Office in Germany, and I'm responsible for the Department of Plant Breeders' Rights, National Listing, and Genetic Resources. And so far, I'm quite close to a lot of the US technical examinations. Following the presentation given by Ben and Leontino, I would like to start with a small perspective on the importance of international harmonization for our daily work, and in particular for cooperation with other countries. I would like to explain that the basis for every bilateral cooperation and exchange of DOS results, exchange of experience, is the harmonization which is reached in UPOV. And we have a very, very comprehensive documentation of all the procedures, which are based on very intense discussions and considerations of different systems all over the world to have a harmonized approach for the assessment of distinctness, uniformity, and stability, but also on many procedures from the administrative point of view. There is a lot of guidance which is followed by the different UPOV members. And a very important medium to exchange and to learn about these international guidance or UPOV guidance is, of course, the participation in the working parties, which is really a very, very good forum to learn about it in more detail. And as mentioned by Nick before, there is such a lot of information in all these UPOV documents that it sometimes it takes some courage to start to read these documents. It's not always easy to understand. Sometimes you read a page and in the end you ask yourself what was in the beginning, because it's not so easy to understand everything. But I always like to encourage everybody to read it, because it's really worth to do it. And a lot of questions we have every day are answered in these UPOV documents. And this is also the basis for our cooperation with other countries, because we ask and agree before that we work on the same test guidelines. There are the UPOV guidelines, of course, first, but also some regional guidelines or national guidelines. Even if another country works with a national guideline, they should follow the UPOV principles. Sometimes there is no need for international harmonization in a specific crop, and the national guideline is fully sufficient. But if we follow the agreed principles, then it's a very, very important document, such a national guideline. Another condition is to cooperate is that all the general principles and guidance is followed, as in TG1.3 in the general introduction, but also in all the TGP documents. Of course, it's very important to have a very precise and detailed look at the reference collection. In my opinion, the assessment of distinctness is the most important and most difficult element in the DOS test. And distinctness as such, if you have the varieties in the field in the same trial, then it's more a technical issue. But to start with the trial and to be aware of all possible similar varieties, that is, I think, the biggest challenge in our daily work. And therefore, it's also important to have a consideration of the reference collection in another country if you want to cooperate with another country. And we look, before we start a cooperation with another country, we look that we have, or that the other country has all varieties in the reference collection which are relevant for our growing conditions. It's important, and the result is that for all outdoor crops, I can say, the cooperation is mainly focused on the neighboring countries with similar growing conditions and climatical conditions. I will come back to that later. And last but not least, it's also very helpful that we have a number of forms developed by UPOV for the exchange of information and for reporting. We understand if we receive a request from another country, we have the necessary information about the breeder, about the breeder's reference, the origin, the technical questionnaire, and so on. and we have the harmonized information in the report, the final report, where we give the information that the variety is, whether the variety is distinct, uniformity, and stable, and last but not least, the variety description is in a format and is in a structure which is easily understandable all over the world in the UPOV family. It takes some time. I'm always not sure if my mouse activity was efficient or not. Yes, as said before, the consideration of an appropriate reference collection, which includes all varieties adapted to our growing conditions, is a very crucial element. And that needs some preparation work. We need a lot of, I think the mouse does not work every time if I try to use it. The fulfillment of all these conditions have to be agreed before we start our request for a report. And it may be necessary and it's important to have an exchange of information, to have perhaps an exchange of varieties if some varieties are missing in the reference collection of the other country. And in general, I think we can conclude that a good understanding of the testing system in the other country is very, very important and the crucial basis for cooperation in the between UPOV members. For us, this international cooperation is very important. I can tell you that within the last, I have just checked our database for the last 10 years, and we sold reports to 44 different UPOV countries or members, and we bought reports from 9 members. That might put a question mark to you, bring a question mark to you, why we take over only or ask other countries only 9 and we sell to 44. That has, of course, several reasons, and one very important reason is that the activity of the German breeders is very high. They apply in their mother country in Germany for national listing and plant breeders' rights for many different species. And on the other side, they are very active all over the world. And therefore, most of these 44 countries which took over reports from Germany really took over the reports because the varieties were already tested in Germany and DOS results were available. The other way around, it's not so important because there are the German or European breeding activity is so high that they apply directly in Germany, and often the first application is filed in Germany, and only if the first application is filed in another country, then we would take over the reports. And therefore there is a kind of disequilibrium between selling and buying, but there are important reasons, and it's not a reason which is mainly linked to technical issues, but more administrative issues. Yes, and to finish my introduction here is, or statement here is, that I would also like to highlight, you might be aware that we have a very, very close cooperation amongst the European countries in relation to the CPVO, the Community Plant Variety Office. And the Community Plant Variety Office uses the technical expertise from the European members. And the basis for all our cooperation within UPOV, that means within the EU, that means also on the regional level, is based on the UPOV approaches. That makes it much easier also for us in Europe to to cooperate and to fulfill the requirements for granting titles. Yes, so far my statement here, and I think the forum is open for questions from all sides.
Thank you, Beate. I would like to thank the participants today to this webinar for your presence and your participation. I would like especially to thank the panelists for providing us with examples and illustrating the theory provided in the beginning of this webinar.